My name is Nick McGrath. I'm a field coordinator with Trees Forever. I'll be your host for the day. I know you're used to seeing the face of Jeff Jensen, but he is off. Well, he's with us today, but he's representing Trees Forever at a conference in Seattle, Washington. I'm sure that's a thrilling trip. I'm excited to hear all about it. But today we have field coordinator extraordinaire Gina Buelow with us to talk about something that I am extremely unfamiliar with, and that is mushrooms. I love to eat them. I think they're cool to look at. I've always wanted to go out and hunt for them, but I also want to live. So Gina's here to talk to us about how to do that and to be alive to continue to go mushroom hunting. As a reminder, you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see and hear you. Please do ask questions throughout the presentation or chime in with comments using this question box here on the side. We'll be able to respond that way, and that's kind of our best way to interact. So please do use that tool. Without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gina to tell us a little bit about mushrooms. Gina, take it away.
All right, sounds good, Nick. So this presentation, I've framed it as mushrooms through the year. So we're going to start with some basic mushroom information, and then we are going to go into some mushrooms that you can see during different seasons. So to start it off, I am Gina Buelow. I am the Central Iowa Field Coordinator. I'm one of the newest field coordinators on staff. And I recently finished my master's degree at Missouri State University in biology. So I have a very strong scientific background, but I also love being outdoors, love animals, plants, fungi. I did my thesis on turtles and ecology, but being outdoors is really what I like to do. And one of the best ways to do that is by foraging. So of course, I am going to start this with kind of a biology spiel on what a mushroom is. So we have all of these categories of life. We have some single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea. And these are considered prokaryotes. They're very simple-celled organisms. And then we have these different categories called eukaryotes, and they are more complex in the organization of the cell. Plants and animals, they are always multicellular, but fungi and protists can be single-celled. So if you think about a single-celled fungus, it might be a yeast, which is something we utilize a lot in cooking and in other scenarios. But one fun fact is that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So on the right, I just wanted to point out that there are some organisms that look a lot like fungi, but they're not actually fungi. So this guy on the right, that is actually a slime mold. He is not a fungus. He is in that category protist. So if you see a weird looking mushroom that you can't identify for the life of you, it might actually be a slime mold. And these aren't things that people typically eat. In some indigenous cultures, I know that they've experimented with that. But we'll go through our typical fungi. And of course, there are going to be outliers because this is a huge category of life. So what is a mushroom? We have on the left here our typical mushroom that you might see. It has a cap, which is the top part, the top part of the fruiting body of the fungus. On the cap, you might have some scales or some texture there. Underneath the cap, there are a couple different structures that you might find. In our imaginary ideal mushroom, there might be gills, which are these little slits that hold the reproductive spores. But there can also be pores or spines or different structures that hold those spores. Another structure that will either be present or not present is this ring around the stalk. And that is a remnant of a veil that kind of protected the little mushroom as it was sprouting up. We have the stem or the stalk of the mushroom, which supports it structurally. And then we have kind of this little bulb at the base of the mushroom. And sometimes it's really interesting. Sometimes mushrooms kind of sprout out of this bulb almost like an egg. Not all mushrooms do this, but some do. And the mushroom fruiting body is not really the entire structure. There is this vast underground network of mycelium that creates this fruiting body. And the mycelium is super vast. They have all of these little structures, and it's almost root-like, where they have these little, similar to root tips of hyphae. And those help collect nutrients and spread the fruiting bodies. And what's really interesting is that mushrooms and fungus have very strong associations with plants. The mycelium often forms networks with trees or other plants, and they help the trees or other plants sometimes get more nutrients through their mycelium. Other mushrooms are parasitic, so it's a give and take relationship sometimes. But there are mushrooms that do not really follow our ideal mushroom. So on the top right here, we have some coral mushrooms, which does not look like our ideal mushroom. It's more of a coral structure, and this is an edible mushroom pictured here, the crown-tipped coral mushroom. And with our spores, most of the time you can't really see it sporing. There's a time-lapse GIF on the bottom right of a mushroom sporing. And usually this happens over time. And this is how the mushroom can spread its gametes and really reproduce in more of a zone around it. So there are several ways that you can engage with mushrooms. One that I have taken interest in is spore prints. So this is where you can collect those spores that are coming off of the gills of a mushroom, like we saw in that last GIF. And the way you do this process of getting the spore print is I would have, our typical mushroom. I would cut the stalk off, and then I'd put gill side down on a piece of paper, the cap, and then I'd drop a couple drops of water on the top of the cap, which stimulates some spore dropping. And then I'd put a bowl over it so none of the spores just kind of go into my living room and kitchen. Not that that would be dangerous, but I want it all on the piece of paper. So usually I use construction paper, and it is important to think about what color those spores might be that are coming off. So there are tons of different colors of spores and colors of gills. If I know that this mushroom is going to drop black spores, I want to use a white piece of paper. And then, of course, I'd want to use a black piece of paper if they're white spores. But sometimes we get pink spores and green spores. So it's a really fun way. I have just a scrapbook of all of these mushrooms I've identified and their spore prints, and they're just beautiful. And you can also look at them under a microscope and see what shape the spores are, and that can help in identification sometimes. Another way you can engage with mushrooms is to grow mushrooms. So there are these commercially available kits. One brand that I've used in the past is North Spore, and they tend to have a lot of different varieties of oyster mushrooms. So you just make sure to spray these down with water every day, and there's a block of usually sawdust or dirt that is full of the mycelium, and getting it wet stimulates the growth of the fruiting body, and then you can harvest that and eat it. So these are fun to have around. And there's also a local company. I'm here in Ames, and we have the pleasure of having Joy Grow come to our farmers markets every Saturday, and they sell both kits for different mushrooms, and they sell the mushrooms themselves that they cultivate in their indoor chambers. So this is a fun way where, if you're not having the best luck or it's winter, you can buy a kit and enjoy mushrooms in your own house. So probably the most popular way people engage with mushrooms is by eating mushrooms. And on the right, we have 2 establishments that are local here in Iowa that serve mushrooms that are cultivated locally. So the restaurant Kava in Des Moines and then Mulberry Street Tavern, they both sell mushroom dishes. And then on the left, this is maybe not as popular of a restaurant, but that's my kitchen. And I've prepared some puffball mushrooms and bluets. And foraging for your own mushrooms is, one of the most satisfying things when you're eating a meal, is to know that you found this mushroom yourself. So when you are looking for mushrooms, some general tips. You want to trim and brush off as much dirt as you can in the field. Because if you put a dirty mushroom in a bag or a bowl in the field, it's just going to get in the gills or cups of all the other mushrooms, and you just want to minimize that to begin with. So a lot of people bring a little pocket knife with them, or brush it off on their shirt just to make sure you're getting a minimum amount of dirt. You also want to be very careful not to crush them, and you don't want to store them in an airtight bag. So sometimes I see people with these big wicker backpacks that you can put the mushrooms in, and it has some airflow. People also use mesh bags. It's okay to use plastic bags, but be careful not to store them in there too long, or they'll disintegrate and decompose rather quickly. You also want to, when you get them back to your kitchen, typically you want to brush the dirt off gently with a mushroom brush or a toothbrush. So when I'm cleaning my mushrooms, if it looks like a rather clean mushroom to begin with, I just get my mushroom brush, I put a little bit of water on it, and I get any dirt or any bugs off using the brush, and that is all I do. I do not run it through a sieve. I do not soak it. I typically just brush it with water and call it clean, because the cooking process kills, the bacteria. Some people prefer to, be assured that there are no bugs possible in their mushroom, because there are a lot of bugs that specialize on mushrooms and can get into those crevices. There are people that soak their mushrooms in water that is either cold or has some salt in it. A lot of morel hunters do this, specifically because morels are mushrooms that have these little crevices that bugs can get into and hide from you a little bit better than other mushrooms. And a lot of these wild mushrooms that you will encounter, you do not want to eat raw. So you can get, mushrooms from the store, little button mushrooms that you can eat raw in a salad. But when you're outside and you don't know exactly, what this mushroom has encountered in its life, it is important to cook it so it's more sterile for you. So there are different classifications of edibility that I will refer to in this presentation. So the best mushrooms that everyone wants to eat, they are called choice mushrooms. And these are what everyone fights over, like the morels in springtime. Those are choice mushrooms. There are edible mushrooms that are eaten by a lot of people, but there might be some critiques on the flavor. Maybe they're not universally loved, but they're still okay to eat. Then we have mushrooms that are not edible. This might be due to the texture of the mushroom or how fibrous it is. It might be because some people have experienced tummy aches afterwards, but that is also another classification, not edible. And then poisonous Obviously, you do not want to eat these. Poisonous mushrooms can range from, giving you a tummy ache to killing you. So avoid poisonous mushrooms at all costs. We do not want to deal with those. So one of the most important things when you're foraging for mushrooms is IDing them correctly. So one of the books that is the most popular is the Peterson Field Guide to Mushrooms. This has a really good guide to IDing it, a specimen in the book, and it has a lot of different references and pictures. All of the pictures are hand drawn, though. They are very, scientifically accurate, but they are drawn. We also have the Safe Mushroom Foraging book by Iowa State University. And this is actually how I started the presentation, was they have this amazing grid calendar at the front of the book that can kind of guide what's in season for you. And then I also like using this book on the left. This mushroom identification book uses photographs rather than drawings. And I like identifying it in one book and cross-referencing it with the other book just to make sure that that is the correct specimen and identification. One thing that you will notice, and that will probably be a complaint with this presentation, is mushrooms have a lot of different common names. So I might call something one name, but you're familiar with it as another name. Even the scientific names, as useful as it is to call things by scientific names, there is still debate what classification it fits into exactly. And that's another reason to cross-reference things and use the internet. So when you're identifying mushrooms, there's several different specific traits that are useful in identification. This on the right is straight from the Peterson guide, and it starts you out with gill color. So you look under the mushroom and you see what gill color it has, and that starts you on this chart to figure out what page in the book you might find this specimen. The next rung on this circle is the gill attachment. And on the left, you can see several different examples of gill attachment. Sometimes the gills connect directly to the stem. Sometimes they are free from the stem. Sometimes there is a little, wave or gap. So that is one of the big classification traits. And like I said, not all mushrooms have gills, so there might be different classification schemes for mushrooms that have pores or teeth. But if you're looking at a gilled mushroom, this is what you look at. For cap color, oftentimes the gills and cap might not be the same color, so that is another trait to look at. Then there is stalk color and stalk size. And if you follow this guide, you can match up what the gill attachment is, what the cap color is, the stalk color and size, and then it will direct you to a page number. And at that point, you can kind of peruse around that general page number and try to figure out and narrow down what your mushroom might be. There are also different shapes of caps. So you might have a cap that is highly conical versus one that is more funnel shaped. That is something that varies a lot as well. The most important thing to know when you're foraging for mushrooms is to not eat anything you are not 100% sure about. And this is a good example of two lookalikes that would be a big mistake to mix up. So on the left here, we have some yummy golden oyster mushrooms. So these are delicious mushrooms that people love to find, that are around usually throughout the seasons. But then we have poisonous jack-o'-lantern mushrooms. And if you don't know the key characteristics that separate these two different mushrooms, you could get really sick. So with these two specific mushrooms, the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, their underside is also orange, as with their cap. With the golden oyster mushrooms, the cap is yellow, but the underside, the gills, are white. And the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, super cool. They glow in the dark. So if you find them and you're not quite sure what it is, you can turn off your lights in your house and try to see if it glows. And that's just a cool fact about jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, but don't eat them. They are not for eating. So I'm going to get into our different mushrooms that we can find in season. This is how the slides are going to be structured. I'm going to give the season and common name on the very top, and the scientific name is going to be in the top right corner. I'm going to include pictures of our beautiful mushrooms, and then give you a general idea of when they'll be fruiting. I'll give some notes on the taste, smell, or appearance, associations that they have with plants, where it's usually found, and some fun facts. Unfortunately, with mushrooms, people always want to know the tricks of, exactly where you can find them. And, if I'm on a south-facing slope or if I'm next to a dead ash tree. But there are no guarantees, and mushrooms break rules all the time. There might be something that typically fruits in April, but decides to fruit in September instead. There might be a mushroom that is typically growing on a certain type of tree and then fruits on a different type of tree. So it's always up in the air. You're always going to be surprised. And that's some of the fun aspects of mushroom hunting, is you never know if you're going to turn a corner and find something unexpected. So our first mushroom, that is a spring mushroom, we're starting in spring, is our morel mushroom. And this is a choice mushroom. This is one that everyone wants to find and wants to eat. It is typically around in April and May, when there's a good amount of rainfall and it's starting to get a little bit warmer. The trees that they tend to like are dead elm trees, apple trees, and ash trees. There are all of these stories about people going to old apple orchards where there's a bunch of dead apple trees and having great luck. Trying creek and riverbeds is another good trick to looking for morels. And then also there are these plants that are low vegetation called May apples, and they like the same type of microclimates that morel mushrooms like. So when I say microclimate, I'm referring to a specific humidity and temperature of an area. And with May apples, sometimes if you separate the leaves or the stalks of the May apples, they're pictured on the bottom right. Sometimes morel mushrooms are sprouting up in there. Another trick to finding morel mushrooms is you want to use slopes to your advantage. So if you're walking and there's a slope and you're not finding any mushrooms at all, try the other side of the slope. It will have a slightly different humidity and temperature, and it might be the right condition for morel mushrooms. Another good trick is if you do find a slope, like a south-facing slope that has a lot of mushrooms, then look on other south-facing slopes, because we figured out that the temperature is correct there. With morel mushrooms, there are a couple lookalikes. One of the big ways people can differentiate them is, you can see there's one cut in half right here in the picture. Some of the mushrooms are not hollow all the way through. They stop being hollow at the stem, and that indicates it's not, the specific true morel mushroom. Our next spring mushroom is the dryad saddle, which is also referred to as the pheasant back mushroom. And these are around a lot of the year, but most prevalently in April and May. I did find one that was delicious last year in September. But you can find these on living or dead deciduous trees. So our trees that drop leaves, those are our deciduous trees. And this mushroom has a very distinct smell. It smells like watermelon rind. And it also kind of tastes like watermelon rind, what I imagine watermelon rind would taste like if you cooked it up. And these mushrooms can get quite large. I found some that are bigger than my head, but you want to pick them when they are kind of in their prime and tender and not this large fibrous mass. These mushrooms do not have gills. They have an underside that's a polypore. So that is pictured on the bottom right. And what's good about polypore mushrooms is none of them are poisonous. Some of them might not be edible or yummy to eat, but none of them are poisonous. So a lot of the mushrooms in this presentation are actually polypores because they're very distinctive and none of them will kill you. So we're getting into the summer now, and this is our chanterelle mushroom, and there are several different species of chanterelles. They're typically fruiting around July or September, and they have a very sweet smell like apricots. They also have a slight peppery taste, and they like to grow around oaks or conifers, so around oaks or trees that have like pine trees. These also look a little bit like those jack-o'-lantern mushrooms that I talked about earlier, but they have white flesh inside or pale yellow flesh. So if you cut it open, it should be a good signal. Jack-o'-lantern mushrooms also grow in clumps, and these guys are usually solitary. There might be a couple in the vicinity, but they do not grow in clumps. One cool thing about mushrooms in general is if you find a mushroom somewhere, what I do is I get out my phone and I drop a pin on Google Map and I label it chanterelle. And I pick, a couple mushrooms, and then I can come back weeks later and see if any more have sprouted up. Because even though this is the fruiting body and I pick it, there's still that mycelium under the ground that can produce more fruiting bodies. Another quick tip that I'll give is when you are harvesting mushrooms, it's good to leave a couple behind because then it has more chance of sporing and creating more mushrooms. So if you have a lot of mushrooms and there's a chance to leave a couple behind, that's a good idea. Our next summer mushroom is Old Man of the Woods, and this is a really crazy looking mushroom. It's all scaly and has these cool markings on it, and they are fruiting from July to October. They're not necessarily a choice mushroom, but they are very distinctive and something that a beginner forager would have good luck finding. They have white flesh, but if you press your finger on it, it will bruise pink and then turn black. It's best to pick these when they're young, like most mushrooms, because they get kind of fibrous and start disintegrating as they're older. And instead of growing on old stumps or logs, they grow from the forest floor, often around oak trees. And they are said to have a light, earthy taste. One of our other summer mushrooms, which is personally one of my favorite edible mushrooms ever, is the chicken of the woods. And they are super distinctive looking. There's a couple different species that have different months where they're fruiting, but they are especially prevalent around late summer. They're found on dead or dying wood, especially oak. And this is actually a picture of a specimen that I found. They're very striking. They can range from being, a pale yellow to bright orange, and they have a very meaty taste. There's a reason that they're called chicken of the woods, and it's because they kind of taste like chicken. I've prepared it in fried rice before. I've also actually taken strips of it and prepared it like you would like a chicken tender. And you want to get them when they are in these younger stages. They are one that if you leave it too long, they'll become tough and fibrous. But it is also important not to pick them when they're too early. So about this stage that we see in this picture is perfect for harvesting. So into our fall mushrooms, we have the king bolete. And this is another choice mushroom. It's also called a penny bun. And it is fruiting from August to September. It's another mushroom that grows on the ground, not on wood, but it is associated, it does have a relationship with pine and spruce. It doesn't have gills, it has a smooth undercap. And it's called a penny bun both because it looks like a bun, its cap, but it also smells like sourdough bread. One of the ways that you can identify it is it has a specific reticulation of white. It's hard to see in this picture, but if you look very closely, there is a reticulation of white on the pale brown stem, and they do get rather large, which is why they're called the king bolete. Another fall mushroom that is super satisfying to find is the giant puffball mushroom. And this on the right is a mushroom that was found in Jester Park and was featured in the Des Moines Register. So this mushroom is one that can pop up throughout the year, but tends to come up en masse between August and October. And it is best to eat when firm and white. So this one featured here looks perfect. They can get enormous. The problem with this type of mushroom is you can see it doesn't really have a stalk or gills or anything. All the spores are inside, tightly packed. And the way it reproduces is those spores and this flesh starts to deteriorate and it becomes, the reason it's called a puffball is because it becomes kind of puffy, where if it's this green and disintegrating and you squeeze your hands on it, it'll puff up some spores. So you want to get to it before it's at that stage. They're found in fields and meadows. So this is great if you live, maybe near prairie rather than a forest. But they do also pop up in deciduous forests. And they have a mild, nutty, and earthy taste. They are pretty delicious. And one of the coolest ways that people prepare them is by making a mushroom steak. So you can make cross sections of this mushroom and just fry it up in a pan as that section. And some people even season it like it's a steak. There are different types of puffball mushrooms. They're not all this big. There are some pestle puffballs that I've eaten before that are much smaller and shaped like a pestle. And there's other varieties of puffball mushrooms, but this is obviously one of the most notable puffball mushrooms. You also see a lot of shaggy mane mushrooms, and they, like the puffball mushrooms, can be found in lawns or meadows. I found them along sidewalks, just in residential areas. And they tend to come up around August to November, though you can find them in other times of the year. And they have this very distinctive cylindrical cap. It almost looks like an elongated egg. And they have these shaggy bits of the top of the cap that kind of scale up. So with shaggy mane, one of the most important things when you're harvesting it is to prepare it as soon as possible, because this is a type of mushroom that will auto digest its flesh and create this black goop that has all of the spores in it, and it'll just drip onto the ground to reproduce. So even if you get a young mushroom, if you leave it in a plastic bag in your car, it's going to decompose rather quickly. So I would say within like 3 hours of picking one of these mushrooms, you want to cook it up. And they do have a really good flavor, a delicate earthy flavor. I usually just saute them in like garlic and butter. And the perfect time to harvest these mushrooms is when they're about the size of the mushroom that's featured in the top left, that the largest one out of that group. That's a really good time to harvest them and prepare them. One really distinctive looking mushroom that is fruiting in the fall is the lion's mane mushroom. And this mushroom has recently become a very hot topic in health goods and supplements. People have claimed that they are brain boosters, that they might help with dementia. I haven't looked into those studies, but people are putting them into pill supplements. They're also putting them into coffee mixes or as a coffee substitute, where it's supposed to make you more alert without loading you with as much caffeine. But these mushrooms are around from August to September. I've had a really awful experience where I've been walking in the woods and I see one up in a tree about 12 feet up. And there's no way to get to it, and it's just this beautiful mushroom that is unobtainable. So they do grow on deciduous trees, sometimes very high up, and sometimes they grow on fallen logs. They taste very similar to seafood. Some people use it as like a crab meat replacement for maybe vegans out there. And they have these really cool tooth-like spines, and they don't have a stem. And usually they're, this white or pale yellow color. And this is one of the mushrooms too that a lot of these mushroom growing kits, they're starting to include them as one of these mushrooms you can grow in your own home. Another fall mushroom is hen of the woods, and on the left, this is actually a specimen that my professor in graduate school found, and it was 14 pounds. They are fruiting around August and up until late November, and they are another polypore mushroom. They don't have gills. They're similar to the dryad saddle, where it's just a bunch of little holes on the underside. They can be very hard to find. You have to have a trained eye because they are brown on top and can blend in with that leaf litter that you find in the fall. You find them growing at the base of trees, often maple or oak trees, and these are live trees that they are probably stealing nutrients from. And they are said to have a very strong, savory, and peppery taste. So next we're getting into our winter mushrooms, and you might be surprised because who expects to see mushrooms in the winter? But there are a couple species that tend to pop up even into those winter months when the ground is not frozen. So this is a mushroom you need to be cautious of. It is considered an edible mushroom, and it sprouts from April to early winter. It's similar to the shaggy mane mushroom, where it will start to auto-digest and turn into black goo. That's why it's called the ink cap mushroom. But this mushroom is poisonous when combined with alcohol. So you need to be very cautious if you do decide to try this mushroom. It is labeled as edible in a lot of these mushroom books. And you tend to find them at the base of hardwood trees or on the ground. They're pretty common mushrooms. And with that alcohol mixture, some people say, it's just when you have alcohol at the same time as eating this mushroom, but other people claim that even if you have alcohol 3 days before, 3 days after, it will cause an upset tummy. And this is a combination that will not kill you, but make you feel not so good. So be very cautious of that if you decide to go after this winter mushroom. And then our other winter mushroom that I've included is a mushroom with a lot of different common names. So it's called the velvet stem, velvet shank, winter mushroom. And this mushroom can be found throughout the winter. People have even found it when there's snow on the ground, but the ground is not completely frozen. And I think they look beautiful. They're this bright golden color. Their caps glisten and are sometimes a little bit sticky that you can just kind of brush off that stickiness. And then their stems, the reason they're called velvet stems is because you can see it, the color is kind of this ombre where it's white up top and then becomes this velvet color towards the bottom. They do grow on dead or dying trees, especially oak, elm, and ash. They have a sweet, mealy flavor, and they tend to grow in clumps. This is a type of mushroom that is cultivated extensively in the country of Japan, and there it is referred to as an enoki mushroom. That is what's pictured on the bottom here. That is the cultivated version. And this is usually considered the same species as our velvet stem, though there's a little bit of debate about that right now, if it's exactly the same species. But the reason that they look so different is because they are often not exposed to any sunlight at all. They also are provided with a little bit of different nutrients than what they would get in the wild, so they look completely different. But the enoki mushrooms you can find in the store, very similar to the velvet stem that you can find outside. So one thing I will encourage you to do is to get involved in the mushroom community. So there are several different groups that you can join and forays that you can participate in. The Iowa Mushroom Group that has a Facebook page that I follow, and they're incredibly helpful. If you find a mushroom and you're not sure what it is, if you provide photos of the gill attachment, the gill color, the cap, where you found it, there are people that are geniuses that will tell you what the mushroom is. Just make sure you don't take like a blurry picture 6 feet away, or else you might not be able to get an ID off them. They also will sometimes post about different events that are going on and different ways you can engage with mushrooms in Iowa. Another Iowa mushroom club is the Prairie States Mushroom Club, and they do forays every year where people go out and find mushrooms together. And it's awesome to go out with experts that know, secret spots and the best parks to go to and the logs to look for. So I encourage you, if you want to get into going out and finding mushrooms, that if you're near that area, you can look for forays. The Illinois Mycology Association also has forays that they do. And even if you're in urban areas, a lot of mushrooms still pop up in these disturbed areas. I've gone mushroom hunting near Chicago within city limits and still can find a lot of different variety of mushrooms. So I encourage you, if you want to get into looking for mushrooms and exploring this hobby a little bit more, to join these Facebook groups or mushroom clubs. Even there's mushroom identification Reddit pages that you can look at, and people will help you. So I will take any questions that you have, any comments, and then I'll also, if we don't have enough time to address everything, I'll make sure to send out emails and include you all on any cool mushroom questions or comments that people have.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina. We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
What can you tell us about the honey mushroom?
Honey mushrooms, I don't know exactly how to ID them. I haven't found them before. I believe they have a sweet smell to them and they are a pale yellow. I've not had any chance to find them, but there is a little bit of a debate because some people get a tummy ache when they eat honey mushrooms. So there is a warning there that if you are to try honey mushrooms, maybe try a little bit at a time. I believe they are considered sometimes a winter mushroom that will pop up around late fall to winter. Um, and they do have a poisonous look-alike, so make sure that you are looking for those specific traits if you do come across something you think is a honey mushroom.
Okay. In a similar vein, I guess a question that I have as well. I now know that what I came across in the park was a giant puffball. Can in fact eat it, but does it have any poisonous lookalikes?
With the puffball mushroom, there are, let's see, like sometimes earth stars kind of look like them a little bit just because they're both kind of round. I don't think those are necessarily poisonous, but non-edible. I have found mushrooms that look similar to puffball mushrooms, but smell a lot like sulfur. So sometimes giving the mushroom a good smell is helpful too. But those giant puffball mushrooms, there's nothing that gets to that size. So you're pretty
Okay.
safe if you find one of those. Just make sure you cut it open and make sure it's white all the way through. If it's not white all the way through, you can kind of trim out those, areas that are deteriorating a little bit.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know.
Mhm.
What's the biggest mushroom you've ever found? Just for my own curiosity.
Yeah, so I probably, if you count like shelves of mushrooms, I found a pheasant back that was probably about 12 inches in diameter. But it was inedible at that point where, you didn't want to eat that fibrous guy. But I did have a friend, I was super jealous that she found a giant puffball that was enormous, like the size of a beach ball. And that's one of the fun things about mushroom hunting too, is you get to see your friends find the thing that you've been looking for the past month, and you get really jealous about it.
Very cool. Sounds awesome. Are there any mushrooms that are too dangerous to touch? Could you move them around? Could you, position them for photos and then are fine? Or are there some that you should go and immediately wash?
I believe there is one off the top of my head that I can think of. There's this delicate mushroom that's white and capped and has gills. It is called, I believe it's called the Angel of Death. It will not kill you if you touch it, but you want to wash your hands immediately afterwards. I've found one of those before, and I took pictures and I touched it before I knew what it was, but you just got to wash your hands.
Good to know. Good to know. A couple of questions on resources. I guess I
Yes.
just preface to say that as far as trees go, I have 7 or 8 or 9 different guidebooks. They're all good in various ways. Do you know anything about the Mushroom Guidebook by Dr. Tiffany and Dr. Knafus from Iowa State?
I have not looked into those guidebooks. Usually, with the people I know in mushroom hunting, the Peterson guide has been really the standard. But like I said, there are guidebooks that are great and you can cross-reference them. And sometimes I'd rather have a photograph than a drawing. So it really is up to preference.
Okay. What's the best way to freeze mushrooms?
I have not frozen mushrooms before. But I have read that people have frozen like chicken of the woods before, and you put it in a Tupperware and stick it in the freezer. But make sure that you clean it off beforehand. But some people do like to do that just to make sure that, any critters that are scuttling around are deceased.
Makes sense.
Yes.
When you go out and collect, is there a best place to sever the shaft for mushrooms? Does it vary depending on what you're hunting?
There is a lot of debate whether it is best to pick a mushroom or to cut a mushroom or to use scissors versus a knife versus tearing it. So that's all up for debate. Some people like to leave more of the stalk behind. So there's, potential for maybe some regrowth. Um, I tend to just pick the mushrooms. But like I said, it is important to be mindful of how much you're taking, and leaving at least the younger ones behind is a good practice.
Okay, okay. Do you have experience with elm oysters? And if so, can you tell us about them?
Oysters. I'm gonna Google it really quick because it might have another common name.
Sure.
Off the top of my head, I have no experience with that one.
Fair enough.
But the awesome thing about mushrooms is there's like people, when you imagine eating a mushroom, you think of a button mushroom from the store. But there are so many mushrooms that are edible, that are outdoors, that taste completely different, from being like spicy to sweet to meaty. Um, and it's hard, especially when you're first getting into it, to really understand the breadth of this new opportunity.
Um, Beverly says she has large patches of golden yellow mushrooms in the woods, mostly on fallen
Yes.
logs or dead trees. Question, is this common? Or I guess, is it more likely to find them on fallen trees, felled trees, rather than dead and standing?
It's really up to where that mycelium ends up. So if she does have logs that are like impregnated with this mycelium, she's going to see that every year for a very long time. So
Okay,
many people, if those are golden oyster mushrooms, which they very well might be, a lot of people are probably jealous.
very good, very good. Angelique, great question, and something that I experienced earlier this year. Don't collect in your preserves. Don't collect in your state parks.
Hmm.
Make sure wherever you're going, you have permission. Some of this could
Yes.
be finding those people who have done this for a long time and seeing where they go to hunt. Lots of public land available. Just make sure you
Yes.
can be there. Yeah, same goes with
Absolutely.
hunting. Same deal.
Hmm.
Um, any history knowledge of the wood ear or jelly fungus species?
Yes. Wood ear is a really fun mushroom. I've also heard it called the old man's ear, and it is this light purple color and looks like a wrinkly old man's ear, and it grows off the sides of trees. And I have eaten it before. It is something you can eat. It's not a choice mushroom, but it does have a jelly consistency, and people sometimes will dry it and use the dried mushroom in dishes. But the way I prepared it was I sliced it up and I put it in fried rice. Um, that's
Mm,
honestly one of the best ways to experience a new mushroom, is either saute it or um, put it in fried rice. But that is a mushroom. I know it's more common to eat in Asia. It has a very extensive range, but not a lot of people really utilize it here in the West.
okay. are there apps that can identify mushrooms in the field, or well, I guess, and would you trust them?
Um, I am sure iNaturalist has a category for mushrooms. I would use it as a reference if I want to compare my mushroom to other mushrooms. I would
Okay,
not post it and expect to get an answer from AI, just because in one picture you would not be able to get like the gill attachment or the gill color and the cap and the stalk and the area it's grown all in one picture.
fair enough. Makes sense.
Mhm.
Do you know of anyone able to propagate morels? Maybe,
No.
in a home grow kit? Sounds
Um,
great.
yeah, morels, they're a tricky one, and that's why people get so excited in the spring. I haven't heard of anyone being able to propagate them, but I have heard um, somebody told me once that their grandfather would find morels, and when he would trim them, he would put all the trimmings in a bucket and throw them in his backyard. And then he claimed that morel mushrooms would sprout up the next year. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but they have very specific conditions, and no one's been able to nail it exactly that I know of.
All right, big money to be had out there if you can get
Yes.
that done. Any types of mushrooms that create fairy circles?
A lot of different mushrooms do.
Okay.
A lot of the ones I mentioned that grow in lawns, like shaggy mane and chanterelles, sometimes people find them in fairy circles. Um, some of those, white parasol mushrooms that are inedible sometimes grow in those fairy rings. But that's because fairy rings are interesting because that's the shape that the mycelium have taken under the surface. So if you do have a fairy ring and you want to get rid of it, there's very little chance of doing that, because even if you pluck up those fruiting bodies, that mycelium's still going to be around.
Okay. Thinking about where they grow, is there anything special about the soil around specifically oak trees that that would promote mushroom growth?
So it would be that these mushrooms, they have a symbiotic relationship with oak trees. So the oak trees, their roots are going down, and the mushrooms are simultaneously stealing nutrients from the oak tree and also providing the oak tree more surface area to get nutrients. So they kind of have this back and forth, and mushrooms usually choose a specific type of tree when they're developing these relationships and evolution. So oak trees have a lot of friends and mushrooms.
That's awesome. Very cool. We have time just for a couple of more, and then if we don't get to your question, Gina will do so once we get wrapped up here. A couple to kind of close us out. Do you know about the ISU Wild Harvesting Mushroom Certification course?
No, I do not know about that, and I am interested because I'm here in Ames right now, and I'd love to learn more.
Okay, so Dave, if you're out there and you know more, please let us know.
Yeah,
We
that's
may see you
awesome.
there. And then to close us out today, any honorable foraging practices or tips? How do we go about responsible foraging?
Yeah, so I would say don't take what you will reasonably eat. Um, I would also say there is a level of secrecy that people have about their spots. So if you find, a bunch of morel mushrooms in spring, you don't want to make a Facebook post about it, because that spot will not have any morel mushrooms in an hour. So being a little bit secretive about spots, leaving some behind. That's good. You want to not use chemicals or anything in your lawns if you want to be especially mushroom friendly. Mushrooms won't hurt anything. And on that same vein, you don't want to, collect a mushroom that you find on a sidewalk in a residential area if you know that they spray. But another thing I would encourage people to do is to be very helpful and forgiving to people that are coming into the mushroom community. Just be a good guy and be helpful.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, folks, we will get to the other questions and we can email all this out. As a reminder, this is being recorded and we'll send that out with you as well. So feel free to revisit any and all of this. Get in touch with us. Dave, I see you posted a link to that mushroom certification course. Maybe we'll see you there. Sounds like a lot of fun. Something that I could certainly use is to know more about this. So next time I find a giant puffball, I know that it's in fact safe and I can eat that and it's probably very tasty.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Please check in with our Facebook event page to find out when the next one is, and we'll see you then. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.